Hello and welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to paint these clematis that I drew for Garden-tober. There is a video on that drawing if you need a little bit more help and a little bit more talk through. I will of course have the image for the watercolor portion as well up on the screen for you. And I just wanted to show you kind of my quick layout before we dive in. So I've got 2 cups of water, one that's kind of my dirty cup of water, and then when this gets a little bit dirtier or I just need something extra clean, I have that extra cup there. I have a rag and I'm going to be using 3 colors today, at least 3 that are planned. I'm working with some transparent yellow, some quinacridone magenta, also known as opera pink, and some perylene green. And I'm using these in different ratios in order to get the color that I want. I am using some Strathmore 500 watercolor paper from this sketchbook. I think it's 500 or 400. I'll put it up on the screen. I am using the wrong side though. So there is a correct side and then a wrong side if you're using a watercolor notebook. This is technically the wrong side, so in my experience, the watercolor doesn't take quite as well. So it should actually be easier for you to do this painting than it will be for me, but we're gonna go for it anyway. I'm gonna show you the steps that I would use, and if we have any issues with whether it's a resist, I'll show you kind of how to solve that problem as we come across it. But without further ado, let's dive in. All right, as you can see from my reference image, the flowers are a pretty solid pink. It's a very bright pink as well. Although some of the effects of the film, kind of desaturate it. And so in order to get a little bit more of an accurate color, I've pulled in some transparent yellow just to warm it up. So we've got our quinacridone magenta, and then I'm pulling in some of this transparent yellow just to kind of warm it up. We'll probably also use transparent yellow with our leaves and our greenery, but I definitely wanted it to just warm this up a little bit, and then to add a little bit of depth, and this is just a little too bright. So in order to add some of that desaturation and a little bit of that moodiness, we're going to bring in just a touch of our perylene green. And by adding that in, we'll get a little bit more of that depth and interest, and really just something that fits in a little bit better with my color palette. I'm not usually one for kind of the super bright hot pinks, and so whenever I do pull them in, I'm definitely going to desaturate it a bit. For our greenery, I'm kind of thinking that I'll mostly stick with the perylene green. I tend to just enjoy that straight out of the gate, but we will also use a warmer color. We'll have a warmer variety mixed. A good alternative would be like a sap green here. That just, having those 2 options where we have a cooler tone, which is a little bit more blue, and a warmer tone, a little bit more yellow, will give us a little bit more interest and variety. I might even just have one that's real yellow, but we'll desaturate it with just a touch of maybe a slap of our quinacridone magenta. So here we have, straight from the tube, a warmer tone and a desaturated tone. I'll be calling out what I'm using. I won't always have our mixing palette on the screen because I really want you to be able to see what I'm painting. But just so you know kind of what we're going for, the pink will probably stay pretty much the same, but then these are our greens that we're going to be using. So I'm actually feeling pretty eager to start off on these flowers. I'm going to start with a kind of watered down mixture of the paint. And it's a little bit more desaturated because I guess I had some green left on my brush. And I'm just going to try and kind of fill some of this in. This is even a little bit deeper than I would normally go for. So I'm rinsing my brush off a little bit, just lightly, dabbing it off so I'm not transferring a bunch of water onto my palette or onto my paper. We're just going to kind of give a quick wash of color. I'm going to try and focus this on the edges. Some of the flowers, they have a lot more color in the center. Some of them have a lot more color on the edges. So the nice thing is you can kind of pick what you want to do, but I think I'm going to stick with focusing it on the edges a little bit more and repeat. And I'm taking a clean brush and I'm just pushing down in the center, and that will pick up any excess pigment. So I can kind of have a little bit more of that fade and the concentration on the inside. So by clean brush, I mean I've rinsed it off, I've dabbed it off so it's not super wet and it doesn't have pigment on it. And I'm just going to push and pull, and that will pick up whatever I'm pressing down on. Now that only works if it is still wet. Just a good rule of thumb, if you're pushing down really hard, you're picking up pigment or spreading it. And if you're pushing down gently, you're just kind of placing pigment down. And then so again, pushing and pulling. Not pushing hard enough to aggravate the paper, but enough to pick up pigment rather than place it down. You can see some of this irregularity, that's the paper. It resisted the paint a little bit, the paint in the water a little bit at first. So that's kind of something you can expect if you're working with the wrong side of your watercolor paper. I don't have that problem a lot. There's a lot of paper that I use that you can use either side, but I have found with these sketchbooks, it's a problem. So I'm looking at some of the flowers, and it looks like the underside is lighter than the side, the right side, if you will, right side up. And so I'm just going to be a little extra careful as I place that down, that I'm just putting less pressure and a little bit less pigment down. We'll be able to add a shadow in later, but you can always add more. It's easier to add more than it is to pick watercolor up. And this is definitely drying less saturated than I expected. So we'll kind of work with that for the next round. All right, so we've got kind of the first pass down, and you can tell the difference between those that I took a little bit more time on and where I started to get a little bit bored. But just having that little bit of fade on the outside, look at how much more three-dimensional this is compared to these, which they're not too bad, but they're a little bit more flat. So this one, we're more prepared as we're going into the second pass, where this one we're going to have to do a little bit more work. For the second pass, I'm just going to be adding in some different veining, adding a little bit more of shadow detail. We will have to go in again later and kind of continue to add that in. But just to add a little bit more detail, we are going to go in with a quick second pass before we get started on too much of the greenery. For this section, I'm going to be working pretty dry. So there's not a lot of pigment on my brush and not a lot of water. And I found that this gives me a little bit more control, and I'm able to kind of capture more of those details. All right, now quickly to add some shadows, I'm going in with the same color, real concentrated. We'll probably have to desaturate it a little bit more, but we can at least get started here. Just kind of establish a little bit of a hierarchy. See how that just kind of pops it a little bit more? So this is kind of a second and a third pass, with one of them being just some designated shadows. Sorry, this tutorial isn't as chatty as mine normally are. I guess I'm feeling kind of reflective, but I'm really just slowly building this up, adding soft layers of color, dabbing my brush off if it just feels like too much, or if I cover something up like there, wipe clean brush, go in with a little bit of water and just pick it up. Clean it off again, picking it up. I'm just working in fine, small sections, but yeah, not a lot of commentary. It's just slow and steady today. It's a lot of repetition too. It's a good therapeutic piece where I can just kind of daydream and paint. Keep the veining of the flower in mind as you're working, and try and keep your strokes consistent with that movement. It'll help it to look a little bit more realistic overall. All right, now we're going to clean our brush off real well, and I'm going to get into that transparent yellow just a bit, but watering it down, and I'm actually going to dip in just a touch, sorry if you can hear my kids in the background, to that real desaturated pinky color, just a little bit. That'll kind of help to moody this out. See how it's getting a little bit more of like a desaturated creaminess instead of that bright yellow? Just kind of slowly adding that in. That's kind of what I'm going for. And we're going to use this color in the center where these stamen are. And I'm also going to put it on any areas like these buds that have kind of a lime chartreusey green. That'll help to kind of bring that out when I add the greenery over top. So start light, we can always add more. It's almost like a nice tea stain kind of antique-y color. And then kind of right in the middle here, I'm actually gonna soften some of that. So I'm adding a little bit of water, taking a bath tissue, dab that off so it's a little tinted. And then I'm gonna go in with our straight lemon yellow, or nope, what is this, transparent yellow, just kind of in the very center. It is lightened. You know, it's watered down, so it's not going to be too in your face, but just a little bit more here. All right, we're just going to repeat that. So picking some of that up, going into our bright yellow, kind of right at the base. Very lightly over here. We're going to add a little bit more of that transparent yellow, and I'm going to just put a soft glaze on some sections of the leaves. Let's see. And more of these kind of more focal leaves, not really the ones in the background. Just kind of following this. All right, my original plan was to go in with just the Perylene green right out of the tube, but I'm going to actually go into our warmer green, a little closer to sap green, but it's a little more desaturated, and we're going to start there. I might occasionally go in with our straight out of the tube cool tone Perylene green and just kind of tap that in where there would be a shadow. So see how that just kind of naturally deepens that. It's easiest to just tap it in when everything's still wet, but you can certainly go in when it's dry and go from there. For now, I'm keeping the leaves pretty flat. Unlike the petals, I don't want them to be a focal point, and so we're just going to allow them to be a little bit more of the background noise. Some of the yellow, the brighter yellow, or like a tap of the cooler tone green in here will add enough interest without distracting or taking away from the flowers. I'm dealing with some of the resist, so if there's an area where it's just kind of getting difficult to lay the color down, you just kind of gently, I'm not pushing hard, I'm just gently going back and forth until it accepts the paint and the water. It hasn't been too bad. I honestly expected worse. So I'm pretty happy overall with how the paper has behaved. Just tapping a little bit of the cool on this edge since this is a more prominent leaf. And then I think I'm going to add a little to the tip here. See how that warmth shines through that we added? We didn't add any extra. That's just it coming through. I'm avoiding kind of the background leaves for now. We'll add them in a little bit softer in just a bit. See how having that yellow underneath, again, just all we did was add the same tone right over the top. But we've got this extra dimension here in the middle where on the edge it's cooler without really doing any extra work. So that's where an underpainting can be helpful. Since this is more in the background, I really want it to be nice and soft. I don't want it to get too dark too early. It shouldn't look like it's closer to us than this leaf. So especially like ones like this or like this one, you really want to make sure that you're not going in too fast. Making everything look like it's all on the same plane. All right, adding in some of these smaller background leaves, just making sure that they're nice and light. I'm actually probably going to add in a couple more, just kind of where it feels right. And just in the background and soft. Okay, now if I lean back and I squint, or if I make it black and white, everything kind of reads the same. So I can either go a little bit darker on the flowers or a little bit darker on the greenery, and I'm kind of leaning towards greenery. So we're going to dive in and we're going to do a second pass on the greenery. It'll be very much the same. Some things we're going to leave light. So anything that's light and in the background, we're going to leave that. And we're just going to deepen some of these other areas. So I'm actually going to mix a little bit more of the warmer tone. I'm actually going to go back in and add a little bit more of the perylene green. So even though it's warmer than straight out of the tube, it's a little bit more neutral, a little bit more of that deeper tone in here. And we're going to first start by deepening these stems. All right, we've added our stems in. That will help us get kind of a better gauge for how much we need to deepen these leaves in order to get them to read a little bit more interesting. If we look at this in black and white, it's already more interesting than it was before, but we're just going to keep going so that it has a little bit more of that depth and it doesn't stand out as like really dark stems. We're going to start with the ones that are kind of closest to us. We don't want to lose some of that warmth that we had, so I'm going to go in pretty watered down. And kind of like we did with the flower petals initially, we're just going to add some deeper areas. So we've got it all wet. We're going to go in with our perylene green and just add some of these in. That first, that layer of being all wet should help with this experiment. But by adding just that little bit more, and hopefully we won't lose some of that warmth that we have in here. Just tapping some color in. So that's reading a little bit better. Let's repeat on our other leaves. So this glaze will deepen everything a little bit, and then as we're tapping in and mixing in a little bit more of that deeper pigment, that will again add a little bit more of that depth and dimension, and we'll just see how it dries. Again, using kind of the wrong side, if you will, of this paper, I found that it absorbs a little bit more. It'll either like resist and repel more, or it will absorb more of the pigment, and so not as much of the color will stay. So we'll just see kind of how it goes. This is a staining color though, so if you are using perylene green, keep that in mind. Go in light layers. So still avoiding this area where there was some warmth. All right, so this one's a little bit more of like a detail leaf, but I'm also going to take some where I'm just going to add kind of another layer. It'll give it a little bit more of that cooling tone. You're getting some of the characteristics of that perylene green, which does kind of take over. So sometimes less is more, unless you love it like I do, in which case you tend to add more. And we're just going to kind of add it to some of these leaves that are a little more background, a little more, but not like as far back as like say this one might be. And just slowly kind of bring some of these into play a little bit more, so they're not disappearing quite as much. So like, I like this one here. but I'm not going through and adding like extra layers of dimension. I'm letting it still be a little flatter, a little more flat than some of these other pieces, but making sure that we're not losing it. Actually, I'm gonna see how that was just a quick layer, but now you can see it a little bit more. We're gonna do the same exact thing to this one. Not let her disappear. And that's just helping us create what we call our natural hierarchy, where we're deciding what's going to be most important, what really jumps out to our viewer, and prioritizing that, and allowing things that we don't put as much emphasis on, like some of these more background leaves, to stay in the background. Establishing our order of importance so that it's easy for our viewer to just kind of relax, because her eyes are already picking up, his or her eyes, are already picking up the information in the order that we want it to be delivered in. All right, so I've walked away and I've come back. It was only a few minutes, but being able to see everything from kind of across the room has given me a little bit more clarity. This line is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to scoot it over a little bit. That should dry a little bit lighter. I'm going to just put kind of a layer over here of water and just kind of pick that up. It seems to make a little bit more sense now. And then these petals need just a touch more depth. In order to do that, I'm going to take our pinky color, I'm going to wet that again, and I'm going to take a touch of our desaturated green color, and I'm going to put that back into the pink. That will just give us a nice neutral tone. It'll kind of be like adding black, but because it's a little bit more desaturated, it'll appear a little bit deeper to the eye. And we're going to add this in very small doses because it's quite dark. And the key to this is we're going to kind of try and stay farther back instead of getting too close and detailed, in order to make sure that we're not going too overboard. We're just going to kind of add this in small sections, back up a little bit. See how that just caused that to pop? This petal is now over this petal. Just tap it in if we need to. We can kind of give it a little bit of a fade. Grabbing a little bit more, I'm just going to carve this section out just a little bit. So again, we're constantly backing up to make sure that we don't go too far. This, I think, is working well. I don't want to go farther than that. We just want enough to show some definition here and make that kind of pop a little bit more without getting too dark. Wiping my brush off and then using this to just kind of spread this out. Stepping back. And last but not least, we're going to mix some of this desaturated green with some of this creamy tone. I'm actually going to pull in a little bit more of this magenta. So we've got kind of this nice brown tone. Nice and warm, still leans very creamy like our centers. And we're going to use this color to add a little bit of a shadow here, just to kind of bring these two together, so that it all makes sense. Did you color that?
Let me see.
Oh, beautiful.
I'm not done.
You're doing a good job. Okay, put it on the floor and we can finish it. And taking a step back, that is our finished clematis. Now, just looking at it, now that I've said that it's finished, I can see I need a little pop of something over here. So I'm just going to add one of our darker colors. It could be the cool, like the purpley tone, or the more golden tone right there. I'm actually going to go in with a little bit of both. Let's do a little purpley over here. Just because this becomes a little bit of a bald spot. All right, backing up, that's a little bit better. Let's just assess everything. It's looking good overall. I like the depth in here. We added just a little bit more to the leaves as well, just kind of that same purpley tone, although I mixed a little bit more green in it. And just added a couple more flicks to some of these shadow areas just to make sure that it wasn't getting lost. But overall, I'm really happy with it. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like more kind of walk through drawing and painting tutorials, we did this piece earlier this year, as well as some birds and some other florals, but that obviously one page away. This one's a little easier to show you. So if you'd be interested in watching this tutorial, I have that one linked. And until next time, happy drawing.